go directly to the public, because I think we'll have an occasion to exchange our, about our disagreements or no disagreements, between the cracks of this conference. So why don't we just start taking questions?
So this is.
Do you wanna It's not an amplifying device, it's just a recording device. So you need to speak loud.
Okay, so this is actually for Chris. So the analysis of what's not really mattering is very interesting to me. But there's one dimension which I wondered whether you have data on or whether you have an insight on, and that's the level of, you could say, dissatisfaction or skepticism or cynicism about the very project of government or the ability of government to do anything. What's striking about not so much the general election, but the primary election, and maybe some of this was in the general election too, was how candidates who were making their outsider status central seemed to benefit from that, and that was in part because it was an effective way to critique the institutions of governments. And I just wonder whether when you look across time, this is something that could matter, or does matter, or something you might see anything about.
This is an important question and a more difficult empirical problem than it first seems. So when we first looked at trusting government issues in the 1960s, for example, we were pretty enthusiastic about that measure. We thought we were really measuring something. It turned out it just doesn't work at all. It's virtually useless data. In the same way, if we wanted to look at candidates using the outsider rhetoric, and Trump and Bernie Sanders were both instances of that, of course, in the previous election, one does have to remember that they were, in neither case, the favored candidate of the party establishment, so they're naturally going to appeal to that kind of rhetoric. And in every election, people say that they're a fresh start, they're different from what's happened in the past, and so on. So the way I would shape your question to what I know is, when is all this really representing something, and when is it just the kind of everyday stuff that people say to make themselves sound cool? And I'm not aware of careful empirical work on that subject. Maybe Diana knows something, or someone else here. But again, I'm skeptical that this is more than just the kind of normal rhetoric that people do when they're not the inside candidate. If they were the inside candidate, they'd be talking about the benefits of seasoned judgment supporting their candidacy.
Thank you very much. I am John Keane. Thank you very much to the panel. A very stimulating start. I have a general comment about the concept of crisis. It's initially directed to Eve, but I've already warned Eve that I'm going to make this comment. Shayla very helpfully pointed out at the beginning that there's a pretty common understanding of a crisis as a process in time and space where things begin to disintegrate and normality breaks down. And it is a process in which judgments are possible, critique and judgment. I think to this there has to be added, because it's relevant for the differences in the first panel, the way that the concept was Christianized. And I think is not entirely, the Christianization of the concept is not entirely dead. Indeed, I think it's quite alive. And that Christianization effectively shaped the concept of crisis to mean, as Christians use the word crisis, it's the last judgment. It's an apocalyptic view. It's the moment of reckoning where things cannot go on, and there will either be decline and destruction, barbarism, and so on, or there will be renewal and rebirth. And I think that that kind of eschatological view ought, in our discussions, to be removed. And I think, there's a tendency to think of a crisis as either black or white, as either good or bad, as some kind of day of last reckoning. And I think sociologically and politically and philosophically and so on, we ought to rethink that. That's one remark that's meant to be more generic. To Ian, I would say that history really matters for your book. And I think that the norm, effectively, of a cartel party system needs to have built into it, and I'm not sure if you can do it, but it needs to have built into it the history of the birth of party systems under modern representative democracy, and their crystallization in some cases as effectively two-party systems. There were several intersecting forces that made that possible. Let's say they were sociological. The struggle for the universal franchise, that parties could offer the living principle of one person, one vote. The parties, Ostrogorski and Michels remind us, were champions of literacy. They controlled printing presses. The parties offered effectively welfare states before their time. They were sources of employment. As Ostrogorski points out, if you have a newborn child, and if you are a member of the party, there will be some care taken of that child. And if your grandparent dies, they will be buried thanks to the party. They were big employers. They were states within states, and so on and so forth. The question really is, what do parties in the 21st century offer that is equivalent? And that are mobilizing resources, so to say, that give hope, that bring imagination in a very material sense. I think it's very doubtful. This is part of this big future of parties discussion, but I think it's very doubtful that there are equivalent resources that would lead to a rebuilding of parties, given all the decay that you've described and others have described, in using 21st century resources. I think it can't be done. But this book, which you're going to write, I think needs at least to address that question. Thank you.
Shouldn't we collect up some more questions and then we can address them and discuss them?
Okay, and then I'm in the back. Here in the back in there.
Robert Phillips. Three quick questions, one to Chris. When you say that the data is useless, am I correct to interpret you as saying it's useless to predict voting behavior, and that what for you the data is either showing or not showing is how people will vote, but not how people will act once they're elected, for example, whether they'll fire the FBI director or have conflicts of interest. So your concern is voting behavior, and that's what you think an explanatory variable is supposed to explain. Second, to Ian, to build on this question, when you talk about party, it leaves a little blank what a party is, but is your notion of a party simply the entity which aggregates votes in Chris's sense, or is it something which reaches into the lives of persons, not necessarily birth to death, but provides, for example, workplace help and things like that? And so what is your image of the party simply the mirror images of Chris? And finally to Eve, when you say we need change, my question to you is, I couldn't get from the talk, change to accomplish what? What is the normative goal that you have on the table?
In the back.
One question to Chris and one question to Ian. So Chris, in the account that this was a totally normal election, I pretty much buy that, and there's a lot of good scholarship out there, along your own, maybe Kate's up, but there was also a radical failure of party elites to discipline how the Republican nominating process went down. And insofar as you're offering a kind of elitist critique of democracy, I just want to kind of hear more about how that event went down, because that wasn't just politics as well. And then to Ian, on the politics of partisanship, insofar as political polarization is growing, and that polarization and partisanship seem to be correlated or seem to have something to do with one another. That is, Democrats are less likely to split ticket than in the last half century and vice versa. How is it that parties are the answer to whatever problem we found ourselves in?
Maybe one more here. I think, right now.
Thanks. I'm Rainer Baldwin.
So this is a question for Ian. If we think that can you understand me? Okay. If political alienation and the rise of populist leaders is among the symptoms of a democratic crisis, a crisis of democracy, then why would you think, and if that happens actually in the US, in the UK, and in continental Europe, which are cases with extremely different electoral and party systems, right? Why would you think that the multi versus two-party and electoral system difference can explain the similarity of these phenomena that we categorize as crisis of democracy? And the second part of the question is, what about the odd cases where your theory doesn't seem to hold so well? What about Switzerland? You know, Switzerland, okay. Switzerland, you have a multi-party system, consociational government, a lot of direct democracy, and you have even 4 official languages. Right? You do have the rise of a populist party. It's moderate compared to some of the others, but you don't have that amount of political alienation that you see in other systems. And the Swiss tend to explain this by the direct democracy effect. They think this is the most important element that keeps political alienation lower compared to other systems.
Okay, we're going to take one last question for Sheila, and then
I found the focus in Chris's and Ian's presentation on political parties and standard procedures of representation a little bit stifling, okay? And I want to come to some of the openings that I saw in Phil's and Eve's presentations. Of course, at some level, the question of representation, formal institutions, is going to be at the center of a conference about the crisis of democracy. But it is also an extremely narrow, debilitating and suffocating view of democracy to do just that. It kills the institutional imagination, and I'm also going to quote here John Dewey, because it is as if, okay, there is this Anglo-American narrow focus on parties, representative democracy, and there is something else that the continental globalist colleagues are doing. You know, for Dewey, democracy also he says it is the intelligent application or the application of collective intelligence to the solution of human problems at all levels of society and institution. And Phil, in his paper, has a very interesting discussion of an experiment that was done as a result of the use of new technologies with some community groups and internet, and maybe you can talk a little bit about that. And we heard Eve yesterday talk about sortition, assemblies based on sortition, supplementing, not necessarily displacing representative institutions. But I want to open up the framework just a little bit for a discussion of what democracy is, could be, etc.
Yes, so if I can have the last question for this round, I would also redirect John King's question about the role of parties in democracy in the 21st century to Phil and Eve, actually, because I feel from what you described from your experience, the sort of mobilization is still done through, so it's done through these, new forms of action at the municipal level, but I think you still have in mind something based on some kind of movement or party format. And so I would like to know what you see as the role of parties in the 21st century. Could we do without them? Or like would something else take their place, and what would that be? And actually, what role are they performing today? Right, they're supposed to be these great information aggregation mechanisms. Now AI does that better. Do we still need them? And same question to you. So why don't you go first? And then I can-
Do you want us to address these questions only or also the discussants?
As you wish. I'm gonna let you judge.
Pardon?
I'll let you judge what's most important or.
Well, I'll just mention my answers without going into great detail with respect to the discussants, and then if people want to pursue them further, we can. I won't go through all of them because, particularly since they're not here and other people might not be interested in those particular questions. So one thing Jacob was concerned about was, well, what about the presidency in the U.S. system? The best thing to do is the best thing of all would be to get rid of it, but certainly we should the more practical thing to think about is reforms that would align the electoral incentives of the president with the electoral incentives that are going on in Congress. And so thinking about restructuring, again, I don't think primaries are going anywhere in the U.S., but it's imaginable that they could be reformed in ways that made them less capturable by extreme groups. So for instance, you could say that the results of a primary would be disregarded if turnout was less than the party's share, say less than 75% of the party's share in the previous general election, that would unbind delegates to the presidential election, and it would, we might say party leaderships in the House could pick the candidate that would only be overturned by the primary if that sort of threshold was met. But basically, the better reforms would align the electoral incentives of the president with the electoral incentives in the legislature. I completely agree with Jacob that the biggest challenge in the American system is the spatial red state, blue state sorting, and within states, blue cities in red states kind of problem. And the answer to that is bigger and more diverse constituencies, gerrymandering for competition rather than for other things. Duverger's law only really works if the median voter in the district more or less reflects the median voter in the polity. And we have been gerrymandering away from that for decades, and that's just makes the problem worse. I also agree with Jacob that it may be that no institutional system could have managed the race problem since the 1960s. So I don't want to have a Pollyannish view of this, as he called it, this window of opportunity. On the other hand, I think the reforms we've made have made it all worse. And that's the burden of what we argue in the chapter. On the issue about PR versus single-member districts, I also don't want to say that Jacob seemed to think I was saying that single-member districts are more redistributive. All I'm claiming there is that the advantage on the redistribution front that PR systems used to appear to have seems to be going away, and it seems to be going away principally because of the weakening of organized labor and the fragmentation of parties on the left. And we didn't circulate the chapters about Europe for today, but that's the central thesis there. I completely agree with Sue Stokes that there's no perfect electoral system, and there are trade-offs in all of them. I think we didn't communicate clearly enough. We certainly agree there can be small, strong parties. If you have closed list PR, you can have small, strong parties, depending on how the list is set up. Our claim was that with small, strong parties, you tend to get wholesale clientelism. With weak parties, you tend to get real retail clientelism for all the reasons that I talked about with respect to the deals that people make. It is conceivable that mixed systems will do. You can get. We talk about labradoodles and poodledores. A labradoodle has the personality of a Labrador and it doesn't shed. And so, the gold standard for this tends to be Germany. They seem to, it's a mixed system. They have PR and single-member districts. We have a chapter about Germany. And it turns out Germany is very hard to imitate because many of the conditions that made the system work in Germany aren't present in many countries. And in particular, the Germans, for one thing, in their single-member districts have very big districts, big diverse districts. That helps. For another thing, they have the constraints of the EU, which help counteract the centrifugal tendencies in the system. But even in Germany, the conditions that produced the stability seem to be going away with the fragmentation of the left, the decentralization of control of the parties. Look at the SPD. It's going to take 3 months for them to for the leadership to be able to decide whether they can enter into a coalition. Why? Because not only did it have to go to the party conference, it now has to be a referendum among 450,000 SPD members as to whether this can go forward or not. And think of all the side deals that are going to have to be negotiated first to get that done. And so this then also goes to, I think, you raised this alienation's going on all over the world. We agree with that, but these decentralizing reforms have been pursued all over the world. So it's not just in the US, but look at Britain. They've gone to direct election of party leaders. They're avoiding managing disagreements within parties by increasingly going to referendums. They have gone to fixed parliaments, which again weakens party leaderships. They've pursued various forms of regional decentralization. All of these things have weakened British parties. In Europe, country after country after country has gone to direct election of leaders, and more of them in France, for instance. Not only do they have runoffs, which function like primaries, they also now have primaries in some of the parties. So that makes the French system more like the American system. I take the points about parties having been sort of social organizations. There's a great lecture on the history of the Conservative Party. It's actually, he has 6, Vernon Bogdan, or you can Google these up on YouTube. He has 6 lectures on British political parties. But he makes the point that the Conservative Party, which is arguably the longest lived and most successful political party in the history of the democratic world, partly got going in the way that it did because Disraeli understood your point and made it a central agenda of his to mobilize, to organize and mobilize working class would-be conservative voters by doing all the things you said, turning the party into a social organization. I think that's a big challenge. I'm just going to make one more point to address, but maybe I've said more than enough.
Switzerland. Switzerland. The counterexample.
Switzerland. I think Switzerland's an outlier for our argument and for just about every argument. I think it's a very good question. I think it's probably a lot of part dependent history and scale. It's a relatively. I suspect that countries with below a certain level of population have opportunities and options that countries with bigger populations don't have. But I think it is anomalous for us as it is for many people. There's one other point I wanted to make. Oh yes, I think this is an important point. So this again goes to a lot of people, particularly on the left, the European left, like PR because it seems to be more redistributed. I think that there's most of the scholarship about that is based on 20th century data, and we're putting together a data set about this in the last decade and a half, which supplies some grounds for questioning whether there's any redistributive benefit. But the corollary of this is that one of the dangers of PR is that extreme parties can get a foothold in the legislature. This was true in the 1930s, most obviously, when in Italy there was both an insider and an outsider strategy, and in Weimar, the far right parties again capitalized on the fragmentation of the left to get footholds in the legislature, whereas in Britain, the Mosleyites got nowhere, precisely because of the two-party system. And if you fast forward to the last few years, again, the extreme right parties are getting big footholds in the legislature. Look at the AfD in Germany, look at Holland, look at all of these countries where you've got enormous growth of parliamentary presence of the right-wing parties taking advantage of the fragmentation of the left, which is a byproduct of Labour. Whereas in Britain, UKIP in 2015 would have gotten 96 seats in Parliament if they had PR, but got one. You know, that is the difference. That it's a world of trade-offs, but the benefits of PR come with the risk that extremist groups are going to get a powerful foothold in the legislature, and that's not a trivial thing.
Okay. First, let me comment on something Ian raised, which was his comment that majority minority districts were actually counterproductive. I would say that that was not the first choice of civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King and others. They didn't start out saying, oh yeah, we want to have majority minority districts. They started out saying, no, we want the labor movement to integrate and to support civil rights, but only 4 of 72 labor unions agreed to do that, and of those, only 2 really met. You could say the same thing about affirmative action. The first demand of the civil rights movement, in fact, there was never a protest demonstration calling for affirmative action. The whole movement was pushing for full employment, and even continued to do that until the mid-70s, the Humphrey Hawkins bill. It was all about full employment. Margaret Weir, political scientist, wrote a book about how the labor movement, the American labor movement, opposed full employment. They opposed getting bigger. They didn't want blacks and Latinos in the unions because the union presidents thought that blacks and Latinos would not vote for their re-election. And so they joined with conservatives and the President's Business Council and so on to oppose full employment. Probably the only labor movement in the world opposed to full employment. So none of these things were first choices. On the other hand, I do not think African Americans would have accepted no voice whatsoever. My wife's a former voting rights attorney. Single member majority minority districts were supported because that is the only way groups felt they would have any voice at all. But it's never been some sort of idealistic situation where you just have, freedom of choice and okay, what do I want? Like, you really have a choice. And the way African Americans look at party politics, it's bad versus worse. Democrats are bad, Republicans are worse. It's never, oh my God, what's ideal? That's never been the situation. And the biggest divide in the black community politically in their choices and thinking is on their assessment of white people. That is actually where black politics revolves around. What are white people going to do? And then you have differences of opinion. It's not over conservatism versus liberalism or big government versus small government or a lot of taxes, no taxes. It's what are white people going to do? That is the big divide within the black community. So I just think a realist perspective on race politics would pose these issues differently. A second point I wanted to make was that a movement we've been building in the South, the moral majority movement in North Carolina, which has had some success in electing a governor and battling the Tea Party. It's a multiracial movement, and it really broke consciously with the dominant model of interest group bargaining. And basically the theory says no group, whether you're unions, environmentalists, gay and lesbian rights, immigration rights, African American rights, none of us have enough power in America to win by ourselves. The only way any of us win is if we're able to build a strong coalition amongst each other. Therefore, what we need to focus on is not so much our individual issues, our demands, our program. What we really need to work on is our commitment to one another and our relationships to one another. That's been the conversation. And so it means the black ministers went to Southwest North Carolina, which is Klan country, and called public meetings, which from the jump, hundreds of people came to, and said, you haven't seen a dentist. I see your teeth. You haven't seen a dentist. You don't have health care. Why have we been fighting? My people don't either. Why have we been fighting each other for 150 years? Why is that? Why do we have the kind of relationship we have? And it's been those kinds of conversations, which is against kind of an interest group bargaining, and it's all about who gets what resources and push your thing. It's been directly against that. Now, I call it Shakespeare, not bedtime. And where is the great book on how groups interact and overcome historic differences? I haven't seen it. Where is the great book on the impact of segregation, which lasted in America until I was in junior high school, and de facto is still very prevalent in America? I've never seen any kind. There's a recent thin little theory book on what segregation has done. But Jacob brought up space. What has been the impact of 100 years of physical separation? What is the impact of that? Nothing. Political theory, nothing. Not an issue. I think that's a profound gap in our understanding of anything in this country. You ask where Trump has come from? That issue hasn't even come up today. I just think it's profound, the weaknesses in our thinking about the impact of race, and it's physical. And all these materialist Marxists, this is materials. This is real. So where's the analysis? Where's the materialism in it? Not there. The last thing I would mention is I disagree some with John. I'm a little more optimistic. I think there are powerful ways to build political movements, if not traditional parties, now. Quickly, I'll say, 11 years ago, I was permitted by Bloomberg, who didn't really care, and the public housing residents of New York to do an experiment. They were just having 200,000 housing units wired for fiber optic cable. And we asked the Residents' Council, would you allow us to actually bargain with the cable companies and the phone companies, Time Warner, etc., for one collective contract for all of your information services? And the residents said, sure. We got back bids for $32 million a year, which would go to the Residents Association of Public Housing Residents in New York City for a contract to provide cable services, television, cable, for them. This was 11 years ago. It was an experiment. The guy who was working on it for me, a former student, Randall Pinkett, who Archon might know, actually won on The Apprentice and was the first African-American to ever win in The Apprentice, and I lost him for this project. That's a whole nother story. But we did see the power of this approach. So a couple years ago, we teamed up with MasterCard and a home care workers union in Massachusetts, $11.99, and actually There was a Supreme Court case which was basically designed to destroy home care workers' unions. And in response, we organized a whole bunch of workers to have online banking accounts, which moved them away from predatory finance, but it also got away from restrictions that states are not allowed anymore to collect union dues and Medicaid, Medicare. We got around that. And so now all these workers have online banking accounts. They're actually charged much less than the check cashing places they go to. But here's the other thing. We get from terms all negotiated between the union and MasterCard in a progressive bank. Here's the other thing. The next step, what we're doing, MasterCard collects the union dues, by the way, now, and gives it to the union. The next step is what we call community collective bargaining. And we have New York unions now and LA unions about to start on this. That is, we're getting data every week on what all these workers are buying. And so the opportunity for consumer organizing on a broad scale, which was actually an idea of the progressive movement that was shut down by Taft-Hartley legislation in the 40s, there's a lot of potential there. And so we're beginning to approach workers to organize them around buying their cell phone service collectively, buying their cable collectively. The amount of money that companies are willing to pay for that, for these block contracts, are big. It also allows us to approach internet companies that don't manufacture here to have leverage against those kinds of companies. And I think there's a lot of potential there to take a portion of the savings from these kinds of bargaining strategies and to build up political organizations that way. It's kind of doing what unions used to do, but not just limited to the workplace, to the whole broad spectrum of consumer purchasing, etc. And, you know, there's some mayors getting into that. Last year, 700,000 New Yorkers on Medicaid didn't fill their prescriptions because they couldn't afford it. So now we're talking to the mayor about having collective bargaining for pharmaceuticals on the part of poor people. Part of those savings can go to build political organization. Last, I think we're experimenting with creating a lot of new forms of worker empowerment and ownership in the economy, leveraging political muscle into economic power. Trade unions in America, many people don't know it, have over $10 trillion invested in pensions. They don't manage any of it to be in accordance with their values. And so we're beginning to work on that. We're building a furniture factory with Mondragon from Spain, a worker-owned, servicing hospital furniture. And the hospitals, because of political pressure, have agreed to buy it. And these new kinds of things, I think, are spaces where we can build economic and political power simultaneously. And I consider it Robert Dahl on steroids. I mean, it's really taking some of his insights and building and expanding it. And I feel, pretty good about our prospects on this based on what we've seen so far.
3 points. The first one is on the crisis. I agree to avoid the eschatological dimension. It's not about collapse or redemption. I think that the crisis, in my understanding of the term or use of the term, is the point in which the status quo is neither realistic nor appealing. And there is a divorce between the usual reality and the objective potential of the system on the one hand and the expectations on the other. This opens the floors to dangerous developments. It can be a slow motion decay, it can be more explosive troubles, but it opens the floor also to democratic experiments. And I think that we are in such a situation. I think we have to see ourselves as deeply involved in a past dependency. We are used to competitive party elections. We are used to the Western democratic model. And it has had good aspects, but also aspects which were, the black problem, the Afro-American problem in America is one of them. and also dark faces. I am pretty sure that in Europe, if you ask people, you give them a white sheet of paper and you tell them, draw the ideal constitution, a huge majority of them will not include professional politicians and the kind of party politics we have at the time being. But we have to deal with this. This is part of our world, and it doesn't mean that we have to abolish this, but it doesn't mean that we have to keep on this reality, especially at a time where the importance of the legislative is declining because of the globalized world, because of the expectation of the people who are now more members and who do not recognize themselves in the kind of party that John was speaking previously. The change is to be a change in a network society with party politics, with democratic innovations which create other channels for participation, but also NGOs, transnational and supranational movements. I think that we cannot see the change in arriving at only one level. The second thing about the empirical cases, I'm teaching both in France, Spain, and Switzerland. And I used to ask my students, are you satisfied with the political system? First question, and are you satisfied with your political parties? When you ask a question in France among 100 students, usually 95 will answer they are not satisfied, and often the 5 who are satisfied are those, for example, at Sciences Po Paris, who want to be politicians. So when you ask a question in Greece, people laugh. Oh, a stupid question. Or could you be satisfied with this? And the first time I asked this question in Switzerland, 90 students were satisfied. And I thought they misunderstood me. It was a French part of Switzerland, so I repeat the question. And again, 90% say, yes, we are satisfied. It means something. It's not just the banks. It's just not the size. I mean, the size is important. But after all, most European countries are more the size of Switzerland than the size of the US. So you should take much more into account, I guess, the context in which the political system operates. Latin America, I mean, I really think that Latin America is a good case because during decades, even centuries, the liberal democracy in Latin America didn't function well. It functioned for the advantage of a very small elite. The vast majority of the people was not included in the political system. Formally, it could have been after the franchise, but in fact, it was not. And the experiment in Latin America in the last decades, the new Latin American constitutionalism is part of the answer. And I think that there has been something going on, very interesting. But we also see the limits of what has been done. And I guess that with more political imagination, the result could perhaps have been different. And I have always doubts about examples that tend to say referendums are not satisfactory. See the Brexit, see the French referendum on Europe. After all, the US has done the second Gulf Creek, this is German, Gulf War. It was an elected government. This is not because the American government has done this, that elections per se are irrational. So I always have problems with this. Then last thing about the normative goal of the change. I think that the most important one is to think that we have to imagine a democratic system which will not be only for the insiders, which will be something which could fit not only for the center of the world, but also in the periphery of the world, in all the planets, and we have not yet had such a democratic model. I think that the exportation of the American or European system in Eastern Europe has been a disaster. I think that in a lot of countries in the world, just to put the constitutional democracy as we have experienced it during decades doesn't produce a real democratization of the society, but just give the elites the power to control through other channels what they used to control through autocratic means. So the bet is that a real democratization of democracy could help to give more power, to empower other people than the relative exclusive elite club, which at the time being effectively controls most of the decisions. I don't say all decisions, and I hope that we'll not lose even more our power in the future. But I think that in order to face the new challenges of the century, I mean inequalities, if we take seriously the ecological crisis, we have to find mechanisms in order to represent something which is not the actual people, but which is decisive for the future of the humankind on the earth. This is not elections. This is something different. So we have to open the floor. After all, at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, the world and the Western world faced huge challenges. And, well, there were events which were not very pleasant ones, but there were also answers to these challenges: the welfare state, the mass political parties, direct democracy in some countries. I think we are in the same situation. We have to get rid from what we are used to and invent other things. Otherwise, I mean, I'm not very optimistic.
Okay, we're going to go to 5:30, so I think I suspect this will be the last.
Sure. Thanks. I'm well aware that I'm standing between you and the bar, so I'll be very brief. I wish the problem with the trust in government question was that it didn't predict voting. It's much deeper than that. The problem is it doesn't measure trust in government very well, and it's gone out of use among people who do survey work for that reason.
Could you say a sentence about why not?
How do you know that?
From a great deal of empirical work that was done 30 or 40 years ago. Yeah. And I don't want to go through it right now for the reason I said. Lastly, I'm going to save the party elite, the question about the GOP party elite. Let's talk at dinner, because that's an interesting topic. And I'll just conclude by saying that I think part of the difference among us here, both the audience and the panel today, is about how to think about average politics. And the issue that Shayla raised here, I think, focuses that very, very clearly. Part of what happens when you let ideas and movements bubble up from the ground is that you get exciting ideas and some creative left-wing ideas. Other things that bubble up include the Tea Party, the neo-Nazis, and so on and so forth. So I think these things are mixed, as Sue Stokes emphasized, and that we need to be alert to that. And I would conclude by saying that I know Shayla found some of our views stifling. I guess I would say that when it comes to mass movements, some stifling is good.
That seems like a good number.
No, that's not a good.
Can I disagree with that?
Do you want to disagree with that?
Yeah.
Sure. And we have actually 10 minutes left, so if somebody wants to squeeze in a last question, can we do that before 1 second?
I have to go.
Sure.
I'm not being, I do have to go, but I will see people at that.
Okay, well, I'll skip my comment for Ian then. But I guess people on the panel and the audience disagree with whether or not there is a crisis of democracy. So I want to back up and see whether people agree with the idea that this is a time of the insurgent, right? Which is a less abstract, more specific idea. And you look around and it seems like there's a lot of insurgents around Bernie, around Brexit, around Trump, around even Le Pen, but even Macron, right, devastating the two political parties that had ruled France for the whole post-war period, Syriza, Podemos, many, many others. There's good reason to think that it's the time of the insurgents. So would people agree that that's a less ambitious characterization, but still an interesting one? So that's kind of the first question. The second is, how would you know, this is kind of a Chris question, whether it's just rhetorical or no, whether they are really kind of insurgents in the sense of rejecting either some elements of the political process or some received policy positions that have a center-left, center-right consensus. And then that thought made me think, well, maybe it's not really a crisis of democracy. If you begin with the idea that it's the time of the insurgent, then maybe that's a resurgence of democracy that's causing a crisis of liberalism.
Just to follow up on that comment, there is a sense in which, whether you call it a crisis or not, what we see happening could be seen as disturbing what was an incredibly stable, boring political system that has gone on for a very long time. And because something more radical has come out of that in this particular case, it could be a wake-up call. I mean, certainly some of the smaller elections that we've seen happen since Trump was elected suggest that it's been quite energizing for portions of the public. And as another empirical scholar, there's nothing more boring than studying turnout because it's so flat and so predictable and so uninteresting. So the fact that we are seeing some variance, could be something that suggests that this is something that has awakened people from the classic statement we get from our survey respondents, which is, well, why don't they participate? Well, things kind of go on pretty much the same no matter who gets elected, so why bother? To the extent that people see this as not same old, that could be healthy.
Okay, so we have 5 minutes, so we're going to go now conclusion.
Well, I just want to say I get really nervous when the word suppression, repression is used, particularly now. Given what's happening in this country, the pending expulsion of 70,000 Haitians, the pending expulsion of 200,000 Salvadoranians, the pending expulsion of students on DACA, crackdowns, the rise of the racist right. When there's going to be suppression, it's going to be directed against communities where I live and work. That's where it's going to come down. And so, and I feel like in communities of color, we have absolutely no choice but to mobilize to fight back. If we have no choice, otherwise we're just, prey. And so I just want to take this conversation away from, I think we have to ground it in what's actually happening. And it's fine for academics who are comfortable, who are not under any threat, to talk about suppression. But I take it very personally. One of my good friends' daughter's boyfriend was murdered, 23 years old, in Portland, Oregon last year when he stood up on a subway to defend a young black woman and a young Muslim woman with a hijab. And that kind of violence is happening a lot more than what you know. And there's been a discernible shift in a lot of places in terms of how police are acting, just random violence. And I really think it's a serious thing in this country. And Trump may not be the worst we see in terms of this kind of violence. So I just want to say, I mean, many of us are having quiet conversations with black police unions, with Latino police unions. How can they begin to not participate and counteract if the federal government starts crackdowns here and starts crackdowns? Those are literally conversations that are underway because people are so concerned about where things are headed in this country. So I just want to put that on the table. I really think we have to be very careful in using these words.
I'm on your side on this, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're out of time, but I want to thank our panelists for this very lively exchange. My optimistic self really believes that you don't disagree as much as it could be. And that this will be solved over dinner, and then by tomorrow we'll have found bridges and ways to speak the same language. So thank you very much, and see you tomorrow.
Well, I do rely on the trust of government quite a lot, so I don't know.